Dear friends, here we are. Torah Deep Dive. Very, very important and fascinating topic today of the Torah Deep Dive, the battle over the Jewish birthrate, which is somewhat of a detail in the story of the slavery and the exodus of the Jewish people in Egypt, which is a little bit overlooked, and it's fascinating. We'll learn the history of it as it is taught in the teachings of our sages, and we'll especially see how the Rebbe brings it down to modern day age. Such beautiful ideas, very powerful. So we begin with this week's Torah portion, the Torah portion of Vaera, and we have here the beginning. Most of the 10 plagues happen in this week's Torah portion. And we, of course, know the very first plague that God strikes Egypt with, which Moses, of course, is the one who brings it upon the Egyptians as the messenger of God. It is the plague of blood. So let us read on page 1 from this week's Torah portion, from the Exodus, the plague of blood. Here we go. God said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch forth your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, over their canals, over their ponds, and over all their bodies of water, and they will become blood. And there will be blood throughout the entire land of Egypt, even in the wood and in stone," which means any moisture that's within wood or stone, even that would turn into blood. There wouldn't be even a drop of liquid anywhere in Egypt that remains water. It will all turn into blood. So people think just the Nile turned into blood. No, it's much more severe. Any drop of water you could find anywhere, any moisture, turned into blood. Moses and Aaron did so, as God had commanded. And he raised the staff and struck the water that was in the Nile before the eyes of Pharaoh and before the eyes of his servants, and all the water that was in the Nile turned to blood. The fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile became putrid. The Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, and there was blood throughout the entire land of Egypt. The sorcerers of Egypt did likewise with their secret spells, and Pharaoh's heart was steadfast, and he did not heed them, as God had spoken. Pharaoh turned and went home, and he paid no heed even to this. All the Egyptians dug around the Nile for water to drink, because they could not drink from the water of the Nile. So we have here the basic story. There's the plague. Pharaoh, as with all the 10 plagues until the very last, God made that his heart should be hardened. He would not be deterred by any of these plagues, and he just goes home and he does not pay any heed to this. He says, this is not going to be changing my mind about the Jews and their status as slaves. But this was a month-long crisis in Egypt, that there's no drinking water, as you can imagine, right? This isn't a fun situation. Okay. Now, there's an obvious question. Why did God choose this to be a plague? You know, there's many different options of plagues. God did 10. But why this? So you could just say, well, God just did it, different forms of torture, different forms of plaguing Egypt. But in Judaism, there's nothing trivial. Nothing's by chance. And in Judaism, everything has to, there's always a deeper meaning behind everything. Why blood? Why blood on the Nile? Why is this even plague number 1? So Rashi brings down from the Midrash right away the simple reason why blood was attack number 1, right? The initial attack on Egypt, on the Egyptian morale, was with blood in the Nile. Why? Says Rashi, bottom of page 1. Turn to blood. In Egypt, it doesn't rain. The Nile provides water to the entire land. The Egyptians worship the Nile. Therefore, God first smote the object of their worship and then smote them. This from the Midrash Tanchuma. Very simple. If you want to break the morale of Egypt, first go after their perceived power. They looked at the Nile as not only as a source of water, but they looked at the Nile as their god. So if you could strike their god, what does that do to the morale of Egypt? It destroys morale. It destroys the illusion of having a superpower. This is the reason Rashi gives. And let's read from the Midrash Tanchuma, go a little bit more in depth on page 2, very interesting Midrash. Rabbi Avin, the Levite, said, the Jews profited from the plague of blood. How so? An Egyptian and a Jew were sitting together with a pitcher of water. The Egyptian filled his cup from the pitcher, and his cup filled with blood. But when the Jew filled his cup, it was water, which means this miracle was very miraculous. It would turn from water to blood very instantaneously. The Egyptian said to the Jew, "Give me some of your water." He gave him, and then it became blood. So the Jewish glass of water, you get the Egyptian, right away turns to blood. "Let us drink from the same glass together," the Egyptian proposed. Yet the Jew drank water, and the Egyptian drank blood. Which means, imagine 1 cup of water, 2 people put straws in, and you're both drinking from the same cup at this exact same moment. Blood would come out of the straw of the Egyptian, but the water would come out from the Jew. Only when the Egyptians would purchase water from the Jews at a high price would it remain water, and the Jews profited greatly from this. Okay, let me close this over here so we don't get any noise. Okay. This is the basic common reason given for why the first plague was blood. Blood because you're going after the god of the Egyptians. But, dear friends, there is a much deeper understanding here of the blood on the Nile. Another reason which is given, which touches upon the very essence of the story of the whole story of Egypt. If you look back at the entire sequence, the entire evolution, and the entire development of the story of the slavery of the Jews in Egypt, what were the Egyptians after? Why were they trying to just make the Jews suffer so much? Why all these different forms of persecution? And when you look at it, everything ties back to one goal. The Egyptians had only one goal. The goal is stop Jews from having children. In a certain way, that was the essence of the whole slavery of the Jews in Egypt, to stop the Jews from having children. That's it. Let's read source 3, which is from the verses that at the very beginning of the story of the enslavement in Egypt. Let's read this verse and let's see what's saying over here. Middle of page 2. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know about Joseph. He said to his people, "The children of Israel are more numerous and stronger than we are." Oh, he's noticing. What is he realizing? He's realizing that the Jews are having a lot of children very quickly. So what does the king Pharaoh say? "Get ready. Let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they increase, and a war befall us, and they join our enemies and wage war against us and depart from the land." So the whole concern of Pharaoh is there are too many Jews and the Jewish population is growing. We have to curb their birth rate. Comes the Midrash, a different Midrash, teachings of our sages, and makes a connection between this concern of King Pharaoh wanting to stop Jews from having children with the first plague, the plague of blood. And this gives us a whole new insight into the story of what happened in Egypt. Says the Midrash, source 4, bottom of page 2. God brought 10 plagues upon the Egyptians, and all were punishment for how they schemed against the Jews. Every single one of the plagues was direct punishment for something the Egyptians did. Everything God does is truth, measure for measure, and no bad emanates from God, only good. However, people act badly, God repays them in kind. So there's also justice, and the plagues weren't just arbitrary forms of torture. They were direct, godly responses to the pain that the Egyptians placed upon the Jews. Continues the Midrash, page 3. Why did the plague of blood come? Because the Egyptians saw the Jews purifying themselves from their ritual impurity and after their periods. The Egyptians controlled the waters so that nobody could immerse themselves, and therefore they would not have marital relations and not have children. Measure for measure, God made the waters turn to blood. Ooh. Fascinating what's going on over here. I'm going to read from the Rebbe. The Rebbe is going to unpack this a little bit more. The very first thing the Egyptians did, even before they enslaved the Jews, was they noticed something about the Jewish homes. The Midrash tells us the Jews in Egypt all the years throughout the slavery were very careful with the laws of family purity. And according to Jewish law, intimacy, marital intimacy between husband and wife, should only happen in an environment of purity. And the environment of purity is that the woman goes to mikveh anytime after her menstruation period. There's 7 days of it's called the clean days, and then a woman could immerse in mikveh, which brings upon spiritual purity upon her, and that is when the couple could resume marital intimacy. But during that period, which is usually about 2 weeks, the period and 7 days following that, there is no marital intimacy. And these are the sacred laws of mikveh of the Jewish people. The Egyptians noticed this, that Jewish women were going to bodies of water, and the Jews built themselves mikvahs. It's actually unbelievable. We discovered the Masada Mountain, the Masada Fortress, just a few decades ago. And what did we find there? A kosher mikvah, exactly according to the laws of Judaism, the exact same way we build mikvahs. Today, they found it a Masada from 2,000 years ago. This is how Jews have been living their lives for thousands of years. Unbelievable discovery, this continuity of Jewish tradition. And the Midrash tells us the Jews did this in Egypt. So the Egyptians first said, oh, we see that the couples are not together. There's no intimacy unless the woman goes to mikveh. Let us block all Jewish women from going to water. We're shutting down all the mikvahs, and we're going to put guards along all bodies of water. No women are allowed to go to mikveh. And the Egyptians didn't say openly that they knew about mikveh. They didn't explain why they're doing this. They were just, just new regulations, new environmental, blame it on whatever you want. They made it sound more benign. And that is why the very first punishment that God inflicted upon the Egyptians was, you block the Jews from accessing water, I'm going to block your water as well. Let's read what the Rebbe says, middle of page 3. Measure for measure. The Egyptians wanted to counter the rapid demographic growth of the Jewish people because they were afraid that in the case of a war, the Jews would ally themselves with Egypt's enemies to fight the Egyptians and eventually leave their land. When they observed that the Jewish population growth was related to their women immersing in water, they decided that the way to lower the birth rate was to shut their access to the water so they wouldn't have any places available for immersion. When the woman wouldn't be able to immerse, the population growth would come to a halt. No more intimacy, no more sexual activity in the Jewish homes. The Jewish women were very particular with the laws of family purity, to the extent that there was only one woman who violated them, and her case is specified in the Torah, which is very interesting. The Midrash tells us about one woman. There was only one woman amongst all the Jewish people in Egypt. That she had, I guess she was known that she didn't adhere to these laws. But every other Jew, the Midrash says, every Jewish woman was faithful to these laws of mikveh, even though we see it was very, very difficult to do so. Okay, next page, page 4. The Rebbe continues. The Egyptians thus found a way to combat the Jewish demographic growth while still maintaining a facade of being decent people. They could pretend they weren't mixing into people's private lives, nor enacting draconian decrees. The Egyptians were punished for this scheme, measure for measure, with the plague of blood. In this plague, all the water in Egypt ceased to be water and was transformed into blood. Okay. This was step number 1 of the oppression of the Egyptians against the Jewish people. And very interestingly, this was throughout history. This was a favorite form of persecution against Jewish families. In the former Soviet Union, this was one of the number 1 targets of the czars of the communist regime. Shut down mikvahs. Don't give Jewish women access to a mikvah. And in Egypt, I imagine it was a little bit easier to find a body of water, go to the Red Sea. I don't know. I'm sure it was very difficult with all the Egyptians shutting down access to a mikvah. In Russia, it's freezing cold outside. Any body of water is covered with a layer of ice. They literally they cemented every single mikvah shut. And we know Jewish families that had gaps of years between children. We're talking about a sacrifice of couples not having any sexual activity for years and years and years and years, only because they wouldn't do it in a way which is against God's command, which is unbelievable. I heard once a story of a child who said that her bed was always in her parents' bed, a Jewish family in Russia. And all the years they were in Russia, she slept in her parents' bed, in between the parents. That was her place. And as soon as they were able to leave Russia, all of a sudden she got kicked out of the parents' bed. When she got older, she understood what was happening. The parents put her there as for themselves, like that there's always a certain, you know, a child's in the bedroom. They were never sexually active for years and years and years because they couldn't get to a mikveh. It was impossible. Just the sacrifice of the Jewish people. These are stories of absolute sacrifice. And one of the Chabad activities in the years of the former Soviet Union was to build underground mikvahs, and maintain them, which was very, very difficult. The Rebbe once repeated a story of a very secular Jew. The Rebbe shared the story of how, no matter how secular a Jew is, the neshama is burning. The Rebbe said once, the Rebbe was emotional when sharing it. There was a secular Jew, and he was like the Jewish representative of a certain Jewish city. But he wasn't such a fan of the Orthodox. In any case, a mikveh was found in the basement of a Jew's house. And the KGB shows up, and it wasn't a fun scene. What's this mikveh here? What's this body of water? And this man, a secular Jew, arrived and said, it is not a mikveh. This is where we store water for ourselves, drinking water. And the water was disgusting. It wasn't filtered water, It wasn't. Today, mikvahs are beautiful, Then it wasn't. So the KGB said, it's drinking water, so prove it. Go. So go drink a cup of this water. And on the spot, he took a cup and he drank it. And that act of sacrifice of this Jew got the KGB off their backs. Said, all right, if so, we don't have grounds to shut it down. In any case, this just shows you, there's a certain pattern over here. What the Egyptians did in Egypt, in communist times, and in general, shutting down mikvahs was always a favorite to persecute the Jews, bring them pain, even disrupt the personal family lives and the bonds between a husband and a wife, and to curb the growth of the Jewish people. Okay, so we see here how the very first decree was blocking access to waters. That was the decree. Okay, it didn't work. The Egyptians clearly saw it wasn't working. Jewish women were finding ways to get access to the Nile. There's only a limit of how much you can enforce these things. And Jewish women would hike to very far out. We don't know exactly how they did it. But Jewish women found ways to get access to bodies of water, which are kosher, to go to mikveh. And the Egyptians, within a little bit of time, saw it wasn't working. The Jews were still being able to procreate. Jews were being born. Jewish women were becoming pregnant. And that is when the Egyptians then moved on to phase 2. Page 5. Let us continue the story in Exodus. Source 5. Harsh labor. They said, okay, if we can't block the Jewish woman, let us put the Jewish men to work to such a severe degree that they will not have the time nor the energy to be active in procreation. Let us simply just hound them to the point that there's no such thing anymore of Jewish husbands and wives being together. Source 5. They appointed over them tax collectors to afflict them with their burdens, and they built storage cities for Pharaoh, namely Pitom and Ramses. The Jews built up Ramses. Okay. But as much as they would afflict them, so did they multiply, and so did they gain strength. The Egyptians were disgusted with the children of Israel. They couldn't believe it. The more they afflict the Jews, can you imagine literally at 4 a.m., they would have these guards and servants schlepping Jews out of their beds, throwing them to go work for hours upon hours upon hours in the worst heat of the Egyptian deserts. They couldn't go back home until midnight. Do you really think Jews are having time to make kids? Do you really think there's time for this? There's effort, there's energy, there's interest. But somehow the Jews were having children. So what do? The Egyptians enslaved the children of Israel with backbreaking labor, make it even harder for the Jews. They embittered their lives with hard labor, with clay and with bricks and with all kinds of labor in the fields. All their work was with backbreaking labor. Why did they put them to work? The Midrash tells us it was all for population control. Make the Jews stop having kids, stop Jewish men coming home with even the ability or the energy or anything or the time to procreate. Source 6, the bottom of page 5. They embittered their lives, says the Midrash, the Bechor Shor, which is one of the commentaries based on the Midrash. When Pharaoh saw that they continued to multiply, he embittered their lives further. At first, their job was to build storage cities, but eventually that involved planting vineyards and gardens and more. All the work was backbreaking. They were not given a moment to rest. They were constantly pushed and beaten to work harder and harder, so that at night they would have no energy for having more children. This was a strategy. The Midrash tells us that was even to the point that the Egyptians didn't let the Jews go back home. They said, you have to sleep in the fields. Why? Because going home and coming back, we're wasting time from work. Now the decree is you have to stay in the fields 24/7. Sleep outdoors in the fields at night. So what do they do? The Talmud tells us about the righteous woman of Egypt. All of our grandmothers who were in Egypt, and unbelievable quote from the Talmud, and the Rebbe quoted this very often. Unbelievable story just about the heroines, the heroic women of Egypt. The Talmud tells us, top of page 6. What do? Rabbi Avira taught, in the merit of the righteous woman who were in that generation, the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. It was all in the merit of the woman. What do? When these women would go to the river to draw water, God would prepare for them small fish that would enter into their pitchers. And they would therefore draw pitchers that were half filled with water and half filled with fish. They would prepare 2 pots on the fire, one of fish and one of hot water. They would bring it to their husbands in the fields, bathe them and lather them with oil, feed them the fish and give them to drink, and then bond with them in marital relations between the sheepfolds, which is between the borders and the fences of the fields, as it is stated, when you lie among the sheepfolds. Unbelievable. The Jewish woman didn't give up. They knew it was a mitzvah to have children. They knew that it was in their hands to continue the Jewish people. But they had husbands who didn't have an ounce of energy left, and they were forced to stay in the fields. And as an act of sacrifice, these women would go and prepare a whole day and make fish for their husbands and water, and they would go there and nurse their husbands back to health and to comfort. And with this, they would bond with their husbands out in the fields, in the sheepfolds, between the borders, in like a secluded area outdoors. This is how a generation of Jews were born. Unbelievable story. And the Talmud says, in their merit, God saved the Jewish people from Egypt. Unbelievable story. What does Pharaoh see? It's not working. Can you imagine? The Jews are not allowed to go back home. We're destroying them of every ounce of energy, and somehow they're still having children. How are these Jewish children being born? So it goes further. Then Pharaoh adds another layer of decree. Mass divorce happens. What happens? Source 8 on page 6. Pharaoh commanded all of his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the Nile, and every daughter you shall allow to live. Let us destroy the Jewish people now. Let us destroy any interest in Jews of creating children. Can you imagine if you know that if you have a Jewish boy, it's going to be abducted from you and thrown into the Nile that day? How much interest do you have in having a child? It becomes very difficult to be interested in having children when you know that there's a 50% chance your child's going to be killed. And by the way, every daughter you shall allow to live. What they would do to the daughters is also take away the daughters and abduct them and assimilate them, make them into Egyptians. So what happened? The Talmud tells us what happened then. The Talmud says, it was taught Amram. Amram was the father of Moses. Moses is the son of Amram. So Amram was the greatest of his generation. When he saw that Pharaoh decreed that all boys shall be thrown into the river, he said, we are toiling for naught. Why are we having children? He arose and divorced his wife, and everyone did the same. Mass divorce in Egypt, because they said, that's it. How could we bring children to this world if all we're doing is feeding this genocidal machine? We can't bring children into this world. No more children. Page 7, the Talmud continues. His daughter told him, this is Miriam, Moses' sister. Moses was not born yet, okay? Moses' parents divorced before he was born because they didn't want to bring a baby boy into this world. Miriam, who's only a few years old, she's a toddler, she says, listen to this. His daughter told him, Father, your decree is worse than Pharaoh's. For Pharaoh only decreed to kill the boys, but you have decreed upon both boys and girls. You are not only stopping boys from existing in this world, you're stopping even girls. Pharaoh's decree was only in this world, but yours affects the world to come. Pharaoh's evil decree may or may not prevail, but yours, you are righteous. Yours will certainly prevail. She uses multiple arguments to say, how could you get divorced? And what she's essentially saying is, we have to do our part. We need to bring children to this world. Who knows what's going to be in a year down the line, 2 years? We need to do our part. And even if they get killed, they go to the world to come. But if they're never born, you're robbing these souls of the possibility to live in the world to come, in heaven. So this young girl's words hit the spot, and the Talmud continues. Immediately, Amram remarried his wife, and everyone followed. This little girl caused the whole revolution to be reversed. All the Jews got remarried. And the Midrash says, very interesting, look at this. Ask a question. If Amram remarried Yocheved, rather than saying he took for a wife a daughter of Levi, it should have said he remarried. The verse says he got married. Why say got married? Just say remarried. So the Talmud explains, Rav Yehuda Bar Zavina says, he performed this marriage just as one would do for a first marriage. He sat her on a palanquin, I don't know how to pronounce that, but basically like a fancy stage that you would carry, you know those things you carry with, there's two poles and people would carry a person. So they made a whole wedding procession as if they were never married before. And Aaron and Miriam, the two young children, danced before her, and the ministering angel said, a joyful mother of children. So Amram did a public divorce, and he also did a public celebration of remarriage, and all the people came together. This is the story, the drama, and the multiple phases of the whole battle over the Jewish birthright. Says the Rebbe. Unbelievable teaching over here. Page 7. There is a vital lesson to be learned from the conduct of the Jewish woman. Conduct that constituted the merit in which our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt. This wasn't a detail of the story. The Talmud says it was in the merit of these women and their righteous actions that gave the Jews the merit to be redeemed, the whole Exodus. Regarding the meritorious conduct of the Jewish woman, the Talmud relates the lengths they went to in their efforts to increase the population of the Jews through bearing children. They paid no attention to the difficulties of exile and to Pharaoh's decrees. They didn't deliberate over whether this was the appropriate time, right? If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense to sit back and say, you know what? Now's not the best time to bring children into this world. Now's not the time. We should bring children into this world of suffering. Let's wait till we're free, then we'll have children. That's not what the Jewish woman said. What do they say? They say, we're not thinking about it. We have a mitzvah from God, we're bringing children to this world. Says the Rebbe, it was in the merit of this conduct that all the Jewish people were redeemed from the Egyptian exile. Page 8. Logically speaking, there were reasons to deliberate over whether this was the right time to bear children. Pharaoh had decreed that all of the male children should be cast into the Nile, so their efforts would be for naught. But the greatness of the Jewish woman was that they disregarded these concerns and continued to fulfill their responsibility to bear children with faith and trust in God. The Talmud relates that it was a little girl who spearheaded this path. Miriam turned to her father innocently and said, your decree is worse than Pharaoh's. Her sincere words led them to dismiss all of their concerns about bearing children and resulted in the birth of Moses, the savior of the Jewish people who led them out of Egypt and brought them to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah for themselves and for all the future generations. Imagine that. One little girl's efforts And one decision of one couple to have a child brought about the greatest moments of Jewish history. The Exodus, Moses, the Torah, changed the world history. Concludes the Rebbe, the purpose of the Torah's stories isn't just to inform us about what happened in the past. They serve as directives for every one of us in the present time. In our case, this story tells us that we should completely dismiss the concept of family planning and embrace the command to be fruitful and multiply without any qualms. Am I pronouncing that properly? Qualms? Expressing faith and trust in God. So, there's all these considerations today, and good considerations, of why to do family planning. Should we have another child? Are we financially stable enough? Let's wait next year to see if we get a bonus. Prices are going up. Diaper prices have gone up a lot. I can tell you firsthand experience. There's all good reasons why, or maybe we're just too busy. Could we handle it? Maybe our house is not big enough. Maybe it isn't. There's always good reasons. What we learned from the first generation of heroic Jewish families is that when you have a mitzvah, you have to have faith and trust in God. And the mandate to have children and the blessing that these children bring is there's no comparison to the perceived problems. And just like little Yocheved said, just like little Miriam said, Pharaoh's decree, who knows what's going to be in a year, in 5 years, 10 years? Who knows? But your choice to not bring a child now, how could you not bring a child now for, some possibilities of the future? Says the Rebbe, page 9, the consideration that an additional child will increase one's expenses and that this is a reason to decide not to have a child is completely wrong. Our livelihood comes from God, the creator and sustainer of the world. God, in his goodness, provides sustenance for the entire world with grace, with kindness, and with mercy. Clearly, he is capable of providing for another Jewish child. And this was something the Rebbe spoke about at great length. I'll tell you, I once heard from somebody, he says, I am alive right now only because of the Rebbe. He says, my parents had 4 children. They said, we're done. And it was these years, it was in the early 1980s, where the Rebbe spoke a lot about this concept of learning from the original Jewish woman to not give in to different arguments and to do the mitzvah, bringing children into this world. He says, my parents were inspired by the Rebbe. They decided to go off of family planning, and I was born. He says, I would simply not be here if not for the Rebbe and for these talks. Let's continue. Page 10, the Rebbe continues. The lesson to be derived from this is clear. We must work to fulfill the command. Be fruitful and multiply. We have to do this mitzvah. But the Rebbe adds that in our times, this mitzvah is even more critical. Very interesting point here. This is especially relevant in our generation because it is our role to bring Mashiach. 3,000 years into Jewish history, we're the generation which is ready to do the final act and transition the Jewish people into the era of Mashiach. And the sages teach that the son of David, Mashiach, will only come once the storage of souls has been exhausted. Dear friends, very interesting. Let me share this with you. Our sages teach us that there are a certain amount of souls that need to be born. Until all those souls are born, Mashiach cannot come. Every Jewish child born brings us one step closer to the coming of Mashiach. Very interesting. Let's read that in the Talmud. Source 10, on page 10. Rabbi Asi said, the son of David will only arrive when all souls are born. Which means even if the world is ready for Mashiach, Mashiach cannot come until every Jewish soul that was intended to be born is born. As the verse says, a spirit from before me holds back, and souls which I have made. The souls themselves sometimes hold back the coming of Mashiach because they need to be born. Says Rashi, on this teaching of the Talmud, he explains it. There is a divider between the divine presence and the angels. And there, all the souls created during the 6 days of creation are stored to eventually be born into bodies. There is literally a chamber in heaven, and Rashi even gives us the space, the geographical space where this storage room is. And in the 6 days of creation, all souls that ever need to be born were created then and stored in this spiritual warehouse until they're ready to be born. And Mashiach will not come and cannot come until every single one of those until every single one of those souls are dispatched into a body to do its mission here on earth. Wild stuff, no? So says the Rebbe like this, page 11. The above is an addition to the fundamental point that be fruitful and multiply is the first mitzvah in the Torah. The first command to the first mitzvah is have children. The order in the Torah is also instructive. So being first is evidence of the importance of this mitzvah. Be fruitful and multiply must be actualized to the point that we fill the earth. Okay. Now the Rebbe is going to talk about the issue of different concerns. What do we do about the different concerns? So the Rebbe says like this, personal concerns. When we fulfill the mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, we will certainly reach the continuation of the verse, which is also part of the command, and conquer it. Those are the words to Adam and Eve. Be fruitful and multiply and conquer the earth. Fill the earth and conquer it. We will conquer all of the arguments raised by the earth, materialism, and rule over them. Oh, that was a very interesting thing. In order to be fruitful and multiply, we sometimes need to conquer the earth. The earth, the world, throws at us arguments. We can't have children. It's not right. With all these different reasons. We need to conquer those arguments. We need to conquer this materialistic worldview and prevail and still be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Says the Rebbe, there are various concerns that can come into play in the fulfillment of this mitzvah. How much money will it cost? How much effort does it demand? Or the loss of income caused by the challenges of pregnancy, birth, and childbearing, right? First, forget about the price of diapers. Even just the process of creating this child is very expensive. 9 months of pregnancy, which is very difficult for the woman. The costs of having a child cost a lot of money. By the time you leave the hospital with the baby, you're already down a good few thousands of dollars. The Rebbe continues, it could even come up with Jewish arguments. It will disturb us from calmly studying Torah and observing mitzvahs. Too many children, you can't study Torah anymore. It's harder for you to do mitzvahs. Or for those who operate on a lower level, childbearing will interfere with their worldly pleasures, right? You could, less vacations. It's harder to do what you want. So the Rebbe says, page 12, one can take all of these concerns and fashion from them an entire world, a complete philosophy. A world usually comprises both heaven and earth, spiritual and physical. But from these considerations, one can fashion a world that revolves solely around physical concerns, ignoring their spiritual element. So it's true, people have a whole philosophy, a whole worldview, a whole model of what life is meant to look like. And in that worldview, there's no place for more children. This is the world we live in today, right? There's no family who doesn't face this exact issue that the Rebbe discusses over here. Should we have more children? We already have 2, 3, 4, and a dog. It becomes too difficult. We have all these different issues. Could we have more children? Says the Rebbe, continues the Rebbe, conquering these concerns. The proper approach to life is to elevate spirituality above materialism. In the words of the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, chapter 32. We're almost up to chapter 32. Right? So the Alter Rebbe says in chapter 32, to raise and elevate the soul over the body. That's the goal of life. That the soul should be primary and physicality secondary. By doing this, we will conquer all of the worldly material concerns. When we conquer all of our material concerns and disregard them, we will achieve conquest in the literal sense. We will see that all of these concerns were false and misguided. Says the Rebbe, we first have to conquer all of these concerns and forget about them. Disregard them. And it's basically a question of priorities. What's more important? If I have more financial stability or if I bring another one of God's children to this world? No. Which one is more important? And the Rebbe says, you will see, once you ignore these concerns, you will actually see that the concerns were always unfounded. Says the Rebbe, God's blessing brings wealth, and when we fulfill God's will and prepare greater receptacles for God's blessings, we are rewarded measure for measure. When a Jewish man and woman show God the great receptacle they have prepared, by doing all in their power to have and raise sons and daughters devoted to Torah and mitzvot, pleasant to God and to their fellow humans, then they are showered with blessings. The Rebbe says, God, you're showing God that you're ready to bring children and to raise children properly. That's the greatest way to get God's blessings. Page 13, the Rebbe continues, God's blessing brings wealth. So the parents will receive even more than what they need in order to raise more children comfortably, even though Jewish education costs money, unlike public school, which is free. There was also bringing up that concern. If I want to give my children a good Jewish education, private schools cost a lot of money. I get free school. So God, you're pushing, you're pushing me too far. If we're going to have more children, I'm not going to have to send them to Jewish education. Says, don't worry about that. God is going to make sure that you as parents have all the needs that you need, all the means you need for every additional child you bring into this world. In addition to providing for all of the children's educational needs, God will bless the family with wealth. To receive material and spiritual wealth, one must prepare receptacles, because without receptacles, there is nothing to contain the blessings. When we prepare the appropriate receptacles through bearing children, we will witness conquest, control over all material concerns. Somebody here is once again emphasizing this idea, how we have to learn and be inspired from the original generation of Jewish families, especially the Jewish woman, to conquer the concerns. And the Rebbe says, if you compare what the concerns were in those times to what we have in our times, we have first world concerns. Will we have enough money? Will we be able to this? Come on. Then they were talking about genocide. Could we bring a child into this world when every Jewish boy is going to be killed and murdered? Could we bring children into this horrible time of oppressiveness? And by the way, Jewish people face this question in times of the Holocaust, in all times. Is it morally appropriate for us to bring children into such a horrific world? And we need to be inspired by the resoluteness of those original righteous women, the original generation of Jewish women who set the tone and paved the path for all later generations. One final point, dear friends, which is a very, very sharp point over here. Says the Rebbe like this. Page 14. Very interesting. The first time Moses sees God, he hides his face. The first time Moses sees God is by the burning bush, which is at the very beginning of this week's Parsha and the very end of last week's Parsha. Moses immediately hides his face from God, which sounds like a very natural thing to do when you witness God for the first time, right? It just totally overwhelms your senses. You have tremendous fright, so you recoil in fear. So let's read that. On page 14, source 11, this is what it says in the Torah when at the end of last week's Torah portion, and the very beginning of this week's Torah portion, actually the very opening words of this week's Torah portion. The very ending of last week's Torah portion. Okay. Source 11, Moses was pasturing the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro, a chief of Midian, and he led the flocks to the wilderness, and he came to the mountain of God, to Horeb. An angel of God appeared to him in a flame of fire from within the thorn bush. And behold, the thorn bush was burning with fire, but the thorn bush was not being consumed. We all know the story. Moses said, "Let me turn now and see this great spectacle. Why does the thorn bush not burn up?" God saw that he had turned to see, and God called to him from within the thorn bush, and he said, "Moses, Moses." And he said, here I am. These are the very first encounter between God and Moses. Okay. He said, do not draw near here. Take your shoes off your feet, because the place upon which you stand is holy soil. He said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And these are the important words, the critical word. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look toward God. Okay. First time God sees Moses, he turns away his face from looking at God. Okay. In a few weeks, we have a different story. The Jews serve the golden calf. And Moses begs God for forgiveness. God gives forgiveness. And Moses makes a request. I want to see you. Let's juxtapose these two stories. The first time God shows up, he says, I don't want to see you. He turns away. Now Moses comes and says, God, can I please see you this time? What happens then? God says, no. You can see my back, you can't see my face. Very interesting. Right? Moses lost the window of opportunity. When God showed it to him, he turned away. When he asked for it at a later date, God said, I'm sorry, you missed the opportunity. Bottom of page 14. Very interesting. The Rebbe is going to tie this together. Very interesting. Bottom of page 14, source 12. He said, Moses said, show me your glory. God said, you will not be able to see my face, for man shall not see me and live. Okay, God says no, and God says, it's impossible for you to see me. Says the Talmud, page 15, source 13. Fascinating Talmud. You would think it was a positive thing. Moses turning away from God is a positive thing, right? That's like a holy reaction. Talmud doesn't look at it as favorably. Talmud says, no, it was wrong for Moses to turn away. It was wrong. Let's read this Talmud. Such an interesting idea. It was taught in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha that God said to Moses as follows: when I wanted to show you my glory at the burning bush, you did not want to see it, as it is stated, and Moses concealed his face, fearing to gaze upon God. But now that you want to see my glory, as you said, show me your glory, I do not want to show it to you. See that? When I wanted to show it to you, you said no. All of a sudden, now you're coming on your schedule. No. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha interprets Moses' initial refusal to look upon God's glory negatively, as he rebuffed God's desire to be close to him. God shows up to you and says, I want to present myself to you. No, I'm not interested in God. That's wrong. The Rebbe takes this idea and applies it to the issue of having children. And this is heavy. This is radical stuff here. You ready? Middle of page 15. Says the Rebbe, fulfilling the mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply requires the mother and father to take the first step to fulfill God's command. The one who has the control, the first step is, of course, the union of father and mother and their willingness to bring a child into this world. God is the very essence of goodness, and it is his nature to do good. Being blessed with children is one of the greatest expressions of pure goodness and joy. It's the greatest form of goodness that God gives to us, is his gift of our children. But actualization of the blessing, and with spiritual wealth, which leads to material wealth, is completely dependent on the third partner, God. We all know husband and wife could try to do their part, but sometimes we need God's blessing, right? There's a third partner here. Without God providing the soul and actualizing the process, no child will be born. Doctors know this. Infertility is not a perfect science at all. So much is unexplained. You can have healthy parents, for some reason, no children. Sometimes you have parents that there seems to be problems, somehow they have children. It is an area of medicine which really is, even with the evidence, even scientifically, we know there's something a little bit out of our control. You can't measure fertility. Says the Rebbe, top of page 16, God knows what is the best time for a child to be born, both for the child and for its parents. And not only spiritually, but also materially. God knows when to do it. Says the Rebbe, the Talmud relates an incredible story about what can happen when we intervene with our personal concerns and decide to delay matters. When Moses asked God, "Let me know your ways," God answered, "When I wanted, you didn't want it." When God had desired to show Moses his glory at the burning bush, Moses was afraid and passed on the opportunity. As a result, God's response to Moses' request was, "You will see my back, but you will not see my face. When I wanted to show you my face, you turned away. Now you'll only get my back." God forbid to say that God was angry at Moses and quote unquote paid him back for not fulfilling his will. Even for a human being, such conduct would be unacceptable. The point wasn't that God is saying, okay, now, right, tit for tat, you told me no, I get to tell you no. Rather, says the Rebbe, there's a lesson here for us. God knows the future and all the details of the present situation. God knows better than us how to make the judgment call. When we place our trust in God, he will choose the perfect time for the child, for the mother, and for the father. Page 17. As humans, we are all limited in our abilities to judge the circumstances. If we don't rely on God and impose limits and restrictions on our end, thereby stating that we are not trusting God's timing, we are failing to create an appropriate receptacle for God's blessings that can bring us wealth. The intention here isn't to frighten anyone, God forbid, but just to reiterate the teachings of the Torah of truth and the Torah of life. In his kindness to us, God is not compelling us. He's giving us the ability to choose whether we want to enable him to bless us with children in the proper time and circumstances. So Rebbe connects this teaching for Moses as well. Moses tells God, not now, and then he comes and says, God, okay, now I want. And God says, no, that's not the way things work over here. And the Rebbe says, when there's a blessing of God available to us to bring a new child into this world, the worst thing is to tell God, yeah, I like your blessing, not now. 2 years from now, let's take a rain check. It's not the way how God works. God knows what the right time is, when a soul needs to be born. And, God forbid to have to miss that opportunity, to miss that window. So very interesting issue that is really coming forward in the whole story of the narrative of Exodus, and really where we have not just the law to have children, but the precedence of how God wants us to approach this matter, and how the righteous woman of Egypt set the tone, set the precedence of the Jewish attitude to this is. And dear friends, with that, we have this week's Torah Deep Dive. I want to wish you all a wonderful Shabbos. And we'll see you all next time.